Good afternoon, everyone. This is Ann Cuppinger with the McSilver Institute and the Managed Care Technical Assistance Center, and I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Strength in Numbers, Voting and Social Work. This webinar, which is very timely, is part of our series on the social determinants of health. The McSilver Institute, the Community Technical Assistance Center, and the Managed Care Technical Assistance Center have partnered to launch this multi-platform online series intended to help clinical professionals, community health workers, educators, policymakers, and anyone who influences or uses our healthcare system to think critically about the social factors that have a direct and indirect impact on an individual's health and mental health. Throughout the series, we'll bring you information and webinars and all different kinds of formats that help us focus on the linkage between poverty, racial disparities, and health inequities, and discuss ways in which these issues can be addressed to improve health outcomes for everyone. Before we get started, I'd like to take a minute to orient everyone on the webinar to our WebEx system so that you know how to participate in today's event. When you joined the webinar, you were automatically put on mute so that we wouldn't have to deal with a lot of background noise. The best way for you to communicate with us is to use the chat box. So the chat box can be accessed by clicking on the speech bubble icon that's on the top right-hand side of your screen. And if you click on that, it will open up down below a chat box, and you can see that you can communicate with everyone who's participating on the webinar. You can communicate directly with Brianna Gonzalez, who is our host, if you have any technical difficulties. You can also communicate with this is the place where we're hoping that you will chat in any questions that you have as we go through the webinar. And we would encourage you to chat those questions along the way, because that will help us sort of take stock of what questions people have and have a really good conversation at the end of the webinar so that we can be sure we answer as many of those questions as possible. So if you have any difficulty technically, again, you can use that drop-down link in the chat box, chat to the host, and Brianna will help you out. So we're really excited today to have with us, skip ahead here to our presenters. And we're really excited to have three presenters with us today. We have Louisa Hackett, who is the founder and director of Community Votes in New York. Community Votes supports, trains, and activates direct service nonprofits to take on nonpartisan voter engagement work. Their partner organizations have been really successful in raising registration and turnout rates by 50 to more than 100%, including engaging some of the least likely voters, those who have lower income, younger voters, members of different immigrant groups, and communities of color. We also have with us today Lindsay Hodel, and she works for the nonprofit VOTE organization, where she is the national field director, and she has more than a decade of experience in public policy advocacy, community organizing, and nonprofit civic engagement work, both in the western part of the country and nationally. She's also the co-founder of Colorado's Participation Project, a roundtable of direct service nonprofits engaged in client engagement outcomes. And finally, we have Tanya Rhodes-Smith, who is the director of the Nancy A. Humphreys Institute for Political Social Work. And she's also a visiting lecturer at the University of Connecticut School of Social Work. There, she teaches program planning and evaluation, political advocacy, and political social work. So I really am excited about today's presenters, and I think we're going to have a wonderful webinar, and I hope you all will please chat in your questions so we can have a great discussion at the end as well.
Great. So I'll take it from here. This is Tanya Smith. Welcome, everybody. It's really nice to be with you today and to be talking about voter engagement. It's a really important topic, and as Ann said, I am at the University of Connecticut at the Institute for Political Social Work, and we think a lot about ways in which social workers and the communities that we serve can be more politically active and more civically engaged. So what we're going to do today is to talk a little bit about why nonpartisan voter registration, education, and outreach should be part of social work practice, ways to create a culture of voting in organizations and in our service delivery, and then we'll also look at the sort of nuts and bolts regarding voter registration, especially when we think about special populations and some of the important deadlines that affect New York. So there we go. So the first thing I want to talk to you a little bit about is why social work, why voting should be a part of social work practice. And when we think about social work as a profession, and then sometimes as a concept, social work is the work that is done in communities. We really, the whole focus of social work is thinking about the person and the environment. And so we really strongly believe that you can't change communities unless you look at the larger systems, obviously. And so the social work profession has a long history of working in areas of civic engagement. We were very active in the suffrage movement. We were very active in the civil rights movement. And in the 80s, the profession itself registered over 7 million people to vote, and through the Human Serve Project. And so we have it's always been a part of our history, but I think that in some ways we've lost a little bit of that focus in the last few decades. And so we want to sort of take back this conversation and talk about social work as being really important to community health and to individual health, because we know that when you look at communities that vote, they are healthier and have better outcomes in really important ways. They've got higher levels of civic participation, they've got stronger connections, and when we look at even the individual outcomes, when you look at health or mental health or overall well-being, they are better for people that vote. So what we're saying is that the practice of voting is very important to individual and community health. And when we think about the social determinants of health, we know that 70% of our health is determined by social, environmental, and behavioral conditions, what we call the social determinants of health. And so access to resources and access to power is really important in shaping those determinants. And so this is directly related to who's making those decisions, and those are our elected officials. So we'll talk a little bit more about that and give you more information, because there's great research out around this. So, and we also, when we think about voting, we also think about it as a form of empowerment. And I think that there's really no better current example than what we saw in Ferguson, Missouri. When that tragedy happened, we looked at a community that only 13% of the electorate voted. So one of the first things that Ferguson did to rebuild after, I guess it's over a year now, to rebuild that community was to register people to vote. And so now, in the last election for the city council, when we look at who's being represented, that half of the city council is African American, and they had voting rates that were above 30%. So it's not where we want it to be, but there is sort of this recognition that voting is the first step towards change. And then, another, I think, a great example of this is when we look at folks who have been convicted of a felony. And in most states, there is a restriction on the ability of those folks to vote. So when this study in Florida was done, it actually showed that when formerly incarcerated people were given back their right to vote, that the recidivism rates dropped. And those rules are confusing, so it's really important that we all as social workers understand how to re-enfranchise folks by getting them re-registered after, in whatever the rules are in their state. Oh, sorry. So, and another sort of thing that we believe is that voting benefits nonprofits in the communities they serve. So nonprofits whose communities vote obviously have more access to elected officials and increased clout on issues. And that's true for communities as well. Elected officials pay attention to people that vote. And I think what's very important, and I know Louisa and Lindsay will talk more about this, but what's really important for us is that right now, obviously, there's a lot of attention on a national presidential campaign And so people are thinking and talking about voting. But when we look at communities that are not generally voting at the levels at which they should or could, it's oftentimes in those municipal elections that don't get this kind of attention. People don't necessarily know who's on the ballot. They don't necessarily know when the primaries are. And those are really important and have a huge impact on the lives of the communities that the people that we serve through social work and through nonprofit organizations. And so, you know, this is not a conversation, we're not having this conversation just because there's a presidential election coming. What we believe is this is ongoing work and fits into our service delivery all year round. So when we go through some of the reasons that people don't vote, and I'm going to scroll through them fairly quickly, but obviously there's numerous reasons. People think their votes won't count, they don't know where to vote, they don't know about an election, and that's particularly true in a primary that doesn't get that kind of, or in a municipal election that doesn't have the same kind of publicity in the news. And they often don't know who the candidates are. The registration requirements are confusing. In almost every state, they're confusing, and they have deadlines that people don't understand. I don't know if you've ever tried to go to your Secretary of State's office. Every state is different, so the rules change, and it is tough. And then people are busy. So if we think about these barriers, a lot of these are structural barriers, and organizations and nonprofit organizations are in a perfect position to help educate and help address some of these barriers. And we'll talk about ways that people can do that, but just simply knowing about when an election is happening and knowing who's on the ballot and who the candidates are and what the issues are and where their polling places. This is really information that nonprofit organizations and social workers can give to folks. And then when we look at reasons that more organizations, so we often hear social workers, I teach at the University of Connecticut School of Social Work, our field supervisors will often say, well, you know, we don't do this, we don't encourage people to vote because we don't want to be seen as political. And what we're talking about here today is not about the candidate or a party, but about the practice of voting. And so we'll talk more about why this is nonpartisan voter engagement is legal. But again, what we said before is not only do people not know about the process, our clients don't always know about the process, but oftentimes staff and social workers don't know about the process. It can be intimidating. People are busy. We know that our profession is overworked and underpaid in most cases, and it feels like a lot to add one more thing to your organization's service delivery. But what we're saying here today is that we believe this is really important and should be a part of the work that we do. And as Nonprofit Vote says often, nonpartisan is not non-participation. So I'm going to turn this over to Lindsay to talk a little bit about why nonpartisan voter registration is legal. And I think I just handed it to Ann by mistake. Okay. Bear with me, I'm sorry, the technical.
No problem. And can you all hear me? Am I coming through?
Yes, you sound great.
Great, wonderful. Just wanted that quick confirmation. So as Tanya mentioned, my name is Lindsay Hodell. I'm the National Field Director with a nonpartisan nonprofit called Nonprofit Vote. We have offices in both Boston, Massachusetts, as well as Denver, Colorado. I'm based here in the West, where I direct several programs with Nonprofit Vote, including our states program, which Louisa Hackett and Community Votes New York is a part of. And just a quick thank you to everyone for having me today. We are really excited about any partnership that we can strike with schools of social work or other social work institutions, because we know connecting in particular with those behind the scenes on the front lines, those providing services day in, day out, and working at nonprofits are really the the individuals and the folks that we're trying to reach out to and really connect with, and for lack of a better word, hopefully organize. So I wanted to talk a little bit about why nonpartisan voter registration is legal and permissible for 501c3 nonprofits. And Tanya, you stole my quote, you stole my transition, in that we believe at Nonprofit Vote that being nonpartisan and staying nonpartisan is actually an asset in electoral engagement and in civic engagement work, and brings a unique perspective and, again, unique assets to the political and the electoral landscapes. And staying nonpartisan, of course, does not mean non-participatory. It does not mean that you can't be political or politically engaged. We just need to make sure that we stay nonpartisan according to the IRS rules for 501c3 nonprofits. So let's talk a little bit about what those rules are and what nonprofits both can and can't do. So the first thing is that the IRS actually makes it very easy on us as 501c3 nonprofits. They have a great website that orients us to both what we can and can't do during elections, as well as what we can and can't do in more general advocacy realms, or in particular with any lobbying that we may want to embark upon. And so the IRS gives us one clear rule, which you can see kind of in the right-hand middle side of your screen. A 501c3 nonprofit may not make an endorsement of a candidate for public office. I'm going to differentiate that from ballot measures in just a sec, but a 501c3 cannot make an endorsement either opposing or supporting a candidate for public office. And this, an important note on this is that this also applies to all elections at all levels. It applies to presidential and congressional elections, state-level elections, as well as municipal and any special elections, even though those particular elections may be quote-unquote nonpartisan, meaning that those candidates may or may not be, are not running specifically as Democrats or Republicans. And so even in those nonpartisan elections, we can't oppose or endorse a candidate for public office. That also means that we can't donate money or resources to a candidate or a political party, and we also cannot rank or rate candidates on their positions on issues. That would be making an indirect endorsement or an indirect opposition. And so the good news is that the IRS sanctions and encourages nonprofits to do a whole range of other activities when it comes to elections. And there's actually a lot more that we can do as nonprofits, and I would say we should be doing, than what we can't do. So nonpartisan voter registration and engagement is legal and encouraged by the IRS, and that can include voter registration work, voter education, get out the vote work, or GOTV as it's sometimes called, and also, very importantly, engaging directly with candidates and connecting candidates to the communities we serve, our staff, our organizations, as long as we're staying nonpartisan. And in particular, just to put a finer point on this subject, not only does the IRS encourage nonprofits to get in the game around elections, we actually have some federal legislation that requires many nonprofits to offer their clients an opportunity to register to vote. So the 1993 National Voter Registration Act, or NVRA as it's sometimes called, includes a couple provisions. The most commonly recognized provision is the Motor Voter Act, the requirement that individuals are offered an opportunity to register to vote when they sign up for a driver's license. Most folks also may not know that the NVRA also includes a provision for social service providers of a certain list of federal programs to also be offering an opportunity to register to vote to their clients at various points of service. This mandate is not consistently enforced across states. It's not very well known, and so some of our peers in the field, as well as Nonprofit Vote, are really excited to be educating nonprofits and foundations and schools of social work in particular about the NVRA as well. In addition, not only does the IRS encourage us and allow us to do nonpartisan voter engagement work as nonprofits, but we also know that when we do this work, we are incredibly effective. And I think that this is so important for us as nonprofits for a couple of reasons. First of all, evaluation is becoming more and more an incredibly important part of any fundraising and fund development work that we're doing as nonprofits. And we also need to make sure that every single moment that we're spending serving and supporting our communities is incredibly effective and is well spent. And so we at Nonprofit Vote have engaged in a couple different cycles worth of impact studies where we assess who in our voting universe or who of the individuals that we engage in any given election cycle, who voted and who didn't, and where we had impact and where we didn't have impact. And what we found in both 2012, and I'll also say as well as these findings are also supported from our work in 2014 as well, really showed that nonprofits, first of all, reach and have a trusted relationship with individuals who are younger, lower income, and more diverse than the general public. And we know that these groups historically participate at lower rates, not only during elections, but also in policy advocacy and in other ways in our communities. And so we probably already know this, many of us on the call, but it's really nice to have data sets to back up these findings. And then secondly, the voters that we contacted as nonprofits or our nonprofit voters, they were contacted in person as well as via mail by nonprofits during services, voted at higher rates than other voters in their state. And this is across all demographic categories. And what we really found was that we had our greatest participation impact on voters that are considered least likely to vote, or what are sometimes called low propensity voters. So this was really exciting for us to have some data behind what we felt like we knew was true, and we continue again to find that we continue to have impact in many of these same categories and communities in our ongoing research. And so what our mission is really centered around at Nonprofit Vote is what we like to call voterizing the sector. And by voterizing the sector, we envision a nonprofit sector that treats and sees voter engagement as part of their standard operating practice, as a part of business as usual. We want conversations about voting to be happening at points of service, at staff hirings, during staff meetings, during board meetings, and in larger community events that nonprofits are hosting. And we believe that if the nonprofit sector was more engaged during elections, we would not only see some of these participation gaps close, but we'd also see better policies that reflect the diverse voices that are present in many of our communities. And so by voterizing our organizations, we are working to embed voting into our work with clients and communications with clients, as well as communications with staff and the larger general public. And we know that voter registration, education, voter outreach is not just a one-time event that needs to happen every 4 years when we're deciding who will be president of our country. We know that this needs to be an ongoing conversation about registration and re-registration, because many of the populations that we serve and support are, of course, moving and often more transient, so they may need to re-register to vote multiple times. We also can provide really proactively information about where, when, and how to vote. What we find and what I found in my work and my experience is that voters who are less familiar with the voting process are often very hesitant or even embarrassed to ask for information about where and when and how to vote. And so by proactively offering this information, we can help to avoid that level of discomfort among our clients. And lastly, we can do a lot of work around encouraging individuals to vote on Election Day. We can encourage our staff and give them time off to vote on Election Day, and bring a little bit of festivity and a little bit of positivity back into the elections by hosting parties and otherwise highlighting the Election Day. So that is what I wanted to cover in this section of the slides. I'm going to hand it back. Oh, actually, I'm going to pass it to Louisa to talk about our next slide.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Lindsay. As Ann said at the beginning of the call, I'm Louisa Hackett, and I founded an organization called Community Votes to really help organizations change their culture. And this is a model I wanted to share with you because the nonprofit voter engagement model is really about changing the culture of an organization so that, as Lindsay said, conversations about the importance of voting are normal and part of everyday activities. This is important, we believe, because when the people working for and getting services from nonprofits recognize that their votes matter, voter turnout will increase, and then we believe more informed political decisions will be made. This is really what I call a mini theory of change. So how can a not-for-profit organization make this happen? It can be helpful, I think, to think about approaching this work by levels. A level of informing, a level of partnering, and then a level of leading. And really, these are different levels of intensity for an organization. So in the first level, informing, is using an organization's existing communication mechanisms, such as their website, newsletters, emails, to provide information about elections and voting, where to register to vote, what are the deadlines, those kinds of things, and also to talk about National Voter Registration Day, which is a national effort and this year it's on September 27th. The second level is to think about who you could partner with to invite, for example, nonpartisan good government organizations to come do nonpartisan voter registration at your site. Or if, for example, there's a competitive local election, you could organize a co-sponsor a candidates forum so the community could learn more about where the candidates stand on issues, about issues that they care about, and also give them an opportunity to ask questions of the candidates. And then the last level really would be the ultimate level, which is really to be a leader, and that would be to have figured out how to integrate voter registration and get out the vote activities within ongoing activities year-round. So, for example, one of the groups that I've been working with in the city, they eventually expanded their receptionist job description to include voter registration. The receptionist is required to be trained on how to do this work in a nonpartisan manner. And so when people come in and ask for help or are waiting for help, she is able to give them the opportunity to register to vote should they want to do so. So Lindsay will share now in more detail the variety of ways, more specific ways that nonprofits can do this voter engagement work.
Great. Thanks, Louisa. So a couple different options that you may consider, and you know, I definitely wanted to present this as a menu of options because there are many ways that nonprofits can incorporate voter engagement, or more specifically voter registration, into your service model. Unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to look at it, there's really not a cookie-cutter approach to this work. Organizations provide services in different ways, have various sites or mobile services. Nonprofits are incorporating technology in very new ways in our service provision models, and so how we incorporate conversations about voting is really a creative process that I think is important to have with organizations and to have with staff at all levels within the organizations, from CEOs and senior management all the way to frontline staff, administrators, et cetera. And so a couple different, again, options for including voter registration in your service model. So we can think about embedding voter registration into our agency's ongoing operations. And as a bonus, if we can do this year-round, even better. So this could include check-in and waiting room processes. We have had a lot of success with volunteer or staff-managed programs that staff tables in waiting rooms and offer with trained either volunteers or staff members offering clients and community members an opportunity to register to vote. And in particular, in some of our qualitative survey work from 2014, we found that active tabling in the waiting room and lobbies of our organizations was one of the single most effective tactics and strategies for groups to help do voter registration and help get out the vote. We can also think about embedding voter registration into our intake and renewal forms, and this may even also be integrated in change of address interactions when folks definitely need to go ahead and re-register to vote. Keep in mind that intake staff and front desk staff, in particular at larger organizations, do have limited time where they're spending with voters. And so the combination of staff at the front desk and doing intake, again, with somebody in the waiting room or lobby is who is trained to register to vote and can actually collect that form back, is one of the most effective kind of combinations we've seen and most effective ways to approach, in particular, having conversations at intake and at that check-in point. And then lastly, you may think about doing voter registration and doing what we call active tabling at special events that you're already hosting in the community. For many of our community health centers, they have a huge influx of community members for community health fairs. They have great success having individuals set up tables as well as kind of canvas, quote unquote, the crowd with a clipboard, signing up individuals to register to vote. So again, that's another really great tactic to consider that can be integrated into something that your organization's already doing. When engaging clients, reminding them that elected officials pay attention to communities who vote, I think can be really powerful. Most of the time, what the research shows and what I think many of our conversations show is that those structural barriers that Tanya spoke about at the beginning of the webinar are very real and are some of the most kind of persistent barriers that we see to people accessing their right to vote. And so reminding voters that the voting process is accessible and that it's important for policy decisions and who elected officials pay attention to, I think is one way to really combat some of those structural barriers. Third, we definitely recommend setting a goal of how many people you want to register to vote. We know that most people will take the opportunity to register to vote if there's an election approaching. Not to say that we shouldn't be doing this work year-round, but many of our registrations really come in the 6 to 8 weeks before any given election. And so our planning needs to happen in advance of those kind of push periods right before the election, and doing some planning and setting a goal of how many people your organization or the organization you're working with, how many people you want to register to vote is a really great barometer for measuring your success and also motivating staff. And then lastly, we can think about ways to make voter registration really visible within our agencies and across our programs. This can include using social media, hanging up posters in our agencies and waiting rooms, and integrating conversations and information about voting into all of our ongoing conversations, services, and communications that we're sharing with donors, board members, and other foundation partners. So really keeping clients and colleagues informed about the elections is another important role that we as nonprofits can play. And lastly, I spoke to this before, but I definitely want to underscore that changing an address does require a new registration form. It is not an automatic update with the USPS or when you change your address or anything like that. You do need to proactively go ahead and change your and update your voter registration. So again, when clients and community members are changing their addresses with us, that should be a really important trigger that we need to make sure to remind them to re-register to vote or go ahead and re-register them. So with that, I will pass it back to, oh, actually, I'm sorry. I'm speaking on the next slide as well. So when we think about voter education, kind of the second step after we register people to vote, we of course need to make sure that they have the information they need and the access to actually go cast their ballot successfully. So there are two forms of voter education that we may consider as nonpartisan nonprofits. First of all, we can offer information on the process of voting. Again, this is an important way to really combat those structural barriers to voting. In many of the research that I've seen, up to 45% of those who don't vote cite structural reasons for not doing so. That's a huge percentage. So offering proactive information on the process of voting can do a lot to help boost turnout. So this could include informing clients of the date of the election, polling place hours, where to get help if they need help voting, and any early voting and vote by mail opportunities. This kind of voter education can also include providing information in offices as well as any issues that may be either present in the community or that may appear as actual ballot initiatives on any given ballot, so in particular in local elections. And so a couple things that nonpartisan nonprofits can consider is passing out a nonpartisan voter guide or a sample ballot. And also to see what kind of information your local county clerk or board of elections may already be providing. In particular, the City of New York does a great job at producing a sample ballot for every election that doesn't, of course, tell you how to vote, but shows you all of the candidates you're voting on, any ballot initiatives, and other information. And it's a really helpful guide that nonprofits could also provide for communities. And then lastly, when we think about Election Day, or as many of our partners like to think about the final four, or the final 4 days right before Election Day, and that final push that we really want to make to making sure people vote, actually are voting. So a couple things that nonprofits can consider on Election Day is ways to create visibility and making the election visible through posters, emails, and signs. Also promoting early voting and any absentee or vote by mail ballots when appropriate. And lastly, to promote voting on the actual election day. This could include connecting clients to ride services or community partners, and also sending reminders to vote via email, postcards, phone calls, and in person. And lastly, a really important part of many of our programs is collecting and asking voters to sign what we call voter pledges, or pledge to vote cards. So you can see a sample on your screen of a pledge form, but we know that when people promise through a pledge to vote that they will go and vote on Election Day, that they're more likely to do so. And so this is a really great tactic for engaging people around the election, as well as making our votes really visible and public. Many of our community partners are able to cite the number of registered voters that they talk to in any given election and the number of community members that pledge to vote with them in their advocacy and their lobbying conversations. And we really believe that this helps get the attention of elected officials. So pledge cards are also a great way to collect contact information from voters so that you can remind them to vote and provide information on how to vote. And lastly, this is also a great way that we can collect contact information for voters that then can be compared to voter databases. This is the work that we do to effectively measure our impact, to see where we're having an impact on turnout and where we don't. And so pledge cards are one way just to create and build that data set that we can use for ongoing evaluation. So I hope this gave you a snapshot and a few new ideas on what you may do within your organizations to get started. With that, I am going to pass it back to Louisa.
Hello, thank you. I'm going to share a little bit about how to do voter registration in New York State and New York City. As you can see on the slide there are some links to where you can register in person, and also at any agency-based voter registration center. As Lindsay had pointed out earlier, there was a national legislation that required publicly funded entities that interact with the public to register people to vote. And actually in New York City, the mayor has passed legislation, so I believe it's up to like 27 different funded city agencies that are required to register people to vote, and agencies that have contracts with those public New York City agencies are also required to do voter registration. I have to say, when I first started doing this work a few years back, I was very surprised. I worked and still do part-time at a large nonprofit that does management assistance, and when we looked at one of our contracts with the Department for the Aging, we were required to do voter registration. Then we went and looked at our contract with the Department for Youth and Community Development, and lo and behold, we too were required to do voter registration. Can't say that we're doing it. As also noted earlier, it's not often enforced. But one thing you might want to do is look at your contracts to see if, in fact, that stipulation is in there. There is a universal voter registration form that all the states have agreed to accept, so those can be easily downloaded. You can also download the New York State form on your slide there, as well as send it to your local county board of election. I want to point out that in New York State, if you've moved, if you've changed your name, or want to change your party affiliation, you have to re-register to vote or update your voter registration form. Also, if someone has not voted in 5 years, their names will be dropped from the voter roll. So if you haven't voted in 5 years, you do need to update your registration form. So I want to, this is the New York State voter registration form. It's pretty self-explanatory, but I wanted to point out a few different items for you. At the very beginning, you need to check to see if a person is a citizen. Obviously, you have to be a citizen in order to register to vote, and you need to be 18 years old by election day. You do have to have the person provide their name and address, but they are not required to give their birth date, phone number, email, or gender. The Board of Elections asks for that because they will find it easier to be in touch with a person should there be some mistake on the registration form. And finally, they do also ask if you have voted before and in what year. I do want to point out 2 items that can be somewhat confusing. If a person does not have a driver's license number or doesn't have a driver's license or know their number, or if they don't know the last 4 digits of their Social Security number, they can still register to vote and leave that item blank. But the first time they go to vote, they're going to be asked to show identification. Again, this is just for the first time they go to vote. They'll have to bring a photo ID or a utility bill or a bank statement or some document that shows their name and address. So again, if you're registering someone to vote and they either don't have a driver's license or can't remember the last 4 of their social, they can still register, but you just have to let them know the first time they go vote, they're going to have to bring some identification to show. The second item down on the bottom left of the form can be a little confusing. This is choosing the political party. It's very important for not-for-profits to be nonpartisan. Lindsay had talked about that. And this is where sometimes organizations have to be just extra vigilant to make sure that they're not helping a person select a party. So while we can't tell a person which party or give advice about which party or even answer questions about what party supports this or what party supports that, what you can say is if a person chooses not to select a party, that New York State is what's called a closed primary state. So if a person does not pick a party, they will not be allowed to vote in that party's primary. so that you can point that out to a person. That's perfectly appropriate to point out. And I'll just share a little story. When I got out of college, I wanted to be an independent. I didn't want to be part of any party, so I didn't select a party. But then I didn't realize that often the primary elections are what decide who's going to be in the general election, and in particular states that are heavily one party or the other, the decision is often made in the primary. So it took me a while to realize that, so I ended up joining a party. The other item to note in this is there is an independence party. You will see that as one of the boxes in New York State. Sometimes people think that means they're independent and not selecting a party. That's not true. It just means that it's joining the independence party. So finally, if no party is selected, that's okay, but then the Board of Elections will list them as not being enrolled in any party. And one last item, the form must be filled out in blue and black ink. So here are some important deadlines and dates in New York. The last day to register in person is October 14th, and the last day to mail in, as long as it's postmarked, is October 14th. In New York State, we have to register to vote 25 days before an election, unlike some other lucky states where they can actually register to vote on the day of the election. Here in New York State, that's not the case. Polls, obviously, Election Day is November 8th. The polls open very early in the morning, 6 a.m., and close at 9 a.m. So again, if people need to update their voter registration form because of a change of address, they need to get all that information, the form filled out and sent in by October 14th. So in New York State, there are some special populations. States get to make these decisions regardless of what other states are doing. There is often a misunderstanding that if people have been arrested or have a felony conviction, they're not allowed to vote in New York State. That's not true. Individuals with a felony who have completed parole are able to register to vote. Unlike in Massachusetts, the minute you leave prison, you're able to register to vote. There was heard a story of a person who does this kind of work. She was on a subway in Boston, and she must have had voter registration posters or buttons or something on her, and she was sitting next to someone who literally had just gotten out of prison, and she registered him on the spot. But not so in New York State. Someone has to have completed their parole. If a person is homeless, they still have the right to vote. It's not a requirement that you live someplace or own a home or rent an apartment. You do, though, have to give some sort of address, and the address literally can be the corner of the park bench where you sleep, but you do have to have some place where the Board of Elections can contact you, so either the shelter or a P.O. box that you may have through a social service agency. And for victims of domestic violence, the local Board of Elections can give them confidential registration and special ballot information for them so that they can be as anonymous as possible. And finally, persons with disabilities, there's an accessible version of the form, and I just learned this yesterday. In New York State, if someone is disabled and unable to push a button or sign a form, we now have machines that are controlled by a person's breath and a straw, so people with disabilities not only are able to register to vote, they are also able to vote. We have the abilities to do that. So I just want to summarize with some important things to remember. As we stated at the beginning of the webinar, there's lots of reasons why people don't vote. And I have found that this very short video, it's 3.5 minutes by Rock the Vote, you can find it on YouTube, History of Voting, goes a long way of explaining how for centuries people have fought for the right to vote, and it has gone a long way to convince people as to why it's important. That being said, it does need to be updated because this happened before this recent Supreme Court decision that released some of the Voting Rights Act laws. It's also very important to get leadership buy-in. I have actually found in this work that directors of agencies really quickly get and understand the importance of voting, and they connect, and it can be very helpful to connect to the organization's mission and explain how their mission can be more likely to be achieved should they have an active and engaged population of people that know about what's going on and actually turn out and vote. We have also found that it's very important to find interested staff. I call them the political nerds, and they're in every single organization. They get excited about this work, they see that it's important, and they are willing to sort of take the time and think about how to use existing activities and programs and mechanisms to build out voting. And again, it can be also very important to identify a point person, someone to coordinate with and to help sort of move the work along. And as I said in the earlier slide about the level of partnering, there are other organizations out there such as Nonprofit Vote, Common Cause, my organization, the New York City Campaign Finance Board, and League of Women Voters. We all train volunteers who can come out and partner and do voter registration sessions and tablings with organizations. And I think I'm also, Lindsay, were you going to do National Voter Registration Day?
I definitely can. I was planning on.
Okay.
And maybe
okay,
if I
great.
start, you can add any New York flair or any additional information about what you're planning there in the city. But again, this is Lindsay with Nonprofit Vote. We are really excited to be a co-founder of National Voter Registration Day. National Voter Registration Day is really the sanctioned holiday for democracy. We have been endorsed by the National Association of Secretaries of State, as well as more recently President Obama. We got a shout out for NVRD from Obama last year, so we were really excited about that. So this is one single day of coordinated field, technology, and media efforts to really expand our awareness of voter registration opportunities across the country. National Voter Registration Day happens every year on the 4th Tuesday of September, and this year will happen on September 27th. So you can sign up to be a partner at nationalvoterregistrationday.org, and from there you can also download posters as well as a communications toolkit with sample press releases and sample talking points, as well as social media fodder, everything you could want to really do both communications work as well as actual field voter registration on National Voter Registration Day. Some of our partners nationally include the National Association of Secretaries of State, as I mentioned, and a handful of national, state, and local nonprofit organizations. So we usually get both national as well as local media coverage. So it is very common that you may hear something about National Voter Registration Day when you pop on Facebook, when you log into Google, and when you turn on your news. So again, we hope that you join us this year on National Voter Registration Day. It's a great, fun way to celebrate the elections as well as to do something that meaningful within your organization. We also find that it's often a good way to engage for organizations who may not have the ability to run a full campaign but may want to do something on that single day. So Louisa, if you wouldn't mind, if you have anything planned for New York or the city that folks may want to be aware of. Otherwise, we can just move on to the next slide.
Well, the activities that are happening are very neighborhood-based. Queensbridge and Ravenswood is partnering. There's a community center there, and they're partnering with the local library. So all along Queens Boulevard for, I think it's like 10 blocks, people can register to vote at the subway stop, at the community center, at the local library, and at the second community center. And again, this is sort of locally based, but the Cypress Hills Local Development Corporation, we were just out there talking with their after-school staff. They have 1,200 young people in after-school programs, and they're all going to be doing democracy-related projects that culminate on National Voter Registration Day. So I will advance this one more slide. Here is a list of resources, and for those of you that are on the call that are in the New York area and want to partner with any organizations to do voter registration, Common Cause New York is available, the New York City Campaign Finance Board is available, Community Voices Heard is available also to do this work in Westchester. So are there any questions?
And, just on resources, I think we're listed there, but the Humphreys Institute at the University of Connecticut, we are very happy to support anybody who wants to do this work. We're doing a lot with the profession itself, and, we'll give you slides, we'll give you materials. We've developed a website. And then in terms of I would just reiterate that nonprofitvote.org is an incredible resource for nonprofits.
And there was a question, Lindsay, you might be able to answer this, for starting up a process in a county mental health clinic? Are you there, Lindsay?
So the question that came in was, someone asked, what would you recommend as kind of the first steps that an organization, in this case it was a county mental health clinic, take down this path?
Sure, and this is Lindsay. I can help to at least begin to field that. One resource I'll go ahead and point to on our website at nonprofitvote.org is our Getting Started checklist. So you can do a quick search in our resource library for our Getting Started checklist, and that's a 2-page document that walks you through some of the considerations that you'll need to think about when starting a voter engagement program, including what kind of information you need, what kind of training you may need, and what kinds of questions you may want to facilitate discussion around. So I'll definitely point you to that. Just to give you a couple of, I think, my personal tips, I think the first consideration for organizations getting started is, first of all, establishing the buy-in that Louisa really eloquently talked about. I think it's important to establish buy-in at all levels of an organization so that your programs are effective and meaningful for clients as well as staff. I think organizations that try to skip this step often encounter or may encounter or may be more likely to encounter resistance as they move forward in their programs. And the last thing I'll say is that buy-in doesn't need to be 100%. Those voting champions usually exist within organizations. The flip side of that is that voter engagement may not be everybody's primary passion, and that's okay too. So establishing that level of buy-in, I think, is important, and at least creating a common understanding about why our nonprofit is doing this. The second piece I would... Sure.
Oh, go ahead. Finish your thought, but we do have to allow people to wrap up. So,
got it.
Thanks.
No problem. Sorry, I spoke too long. I would say the second next step is identifying key staff people who will lead your efforts. One point person is usually good, but then in terms of your staff and your work within your organization, perhaps considering a civic engagement committee or another small subset of staff people that will help to coordinate the work, I think is a good next step as well.
Terrific. Thank you. I want to thank all of our presenters. I've learned a lot in this presentation, and I hope everyone else has as well. And I think we also really clearly got the message that all three of these individuals and their organizations are really ready to continue to help you in your efforts. as far as voter engagement and registration and helping to get out the vote go. So I think this has really been a great beginning of the conversation. There are a couple people who have specific questions. We'll make sure that we get those to the presenters and get you an answer. We don't have time to address all of them today. But I hope that you will download the slides, look at the resources that folks are going to make available to you, and check out the websites from each of these organizations. I also will encourage you when this webinar is over to complete the very short survey that you'll receive that allows you to provide some feedback on today's webinar. And on behalf of McSilver and CTAC and the Managed Care Technical Assistance Center and our presenters, I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and I hope you have a great rest of the day. Thank you very much.